75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being.
The Grand Council chamber had always been a sanctuary built for absolute silence, rigorous discipline, and unyielding royal obedience, a place where the heavy whispers of centuries echoed off the dark wood walls and the weight of history hung over every single seat. But the exact moment Princess stepped into the room and calmly placed the late Queen's signed letter onto the center of the council table, the carefully preserved illusion of absolute order shattered instantly, and everything changed forever. Camilla's expression hardened into a mask of pure disbelief. King Charles immediately looked away as if trying to shield himself from a truth he could not bear to face, and Prince William sat entirely frozen without making a single movement. In that one breathless, suspended instant, what was supposed to remain a deeply private royal instruction was transformed into a profound public humiliation, and the entire British monarchy watched in silence as power shifted dramatically without a crown ever changing hands or a formal decree being read to the public outside. Before we fully unravel the intricate layers of what this historic confrontation truly means for the fragile future of the royal family, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a single update on this unfolding drama, and knew the immense weight and the devastating historical consequences of what she carried into that room, refusing to arrive with display of loud rage or dramatic theatricality, but instead arriving with an absolute, unshakable certainty that was far more dangerous than anger could ever be. This private council session, a strictly closed royal meeting where senior figures gathered to settle sensitive matters completely away from the public eye, had been called to resolve a growing and bitter dispute over ceremonial control, household proceedances, and exactly how far Camilla's expanding influence could reach into daily palace decision-making. The Queen Consort had entered the room expecting the usual deferential order, expecting unwavering respect, and fully expecting King Charles to sit firmly beside her as a visible proof that her elevated place at the top of the hierarchy was entirely secure. Instead, and bypasses the usual pleasantries and places a direct, signed instruction from the late Queen Elizabeth II right before them, instantly freezing the air in the room as Camilla felt the sharp strike of reality before anyone could even utter a word of explanation. She had walked into the meeting believing the long-standing matter would inevitably end in her favor, trusting that the council would formally confirm what she viewed as her natural standing beside the king, but Anne's calm and steady hands turned that absolute belief into sudden, biting embarrassment. Charles felt the heavy pressure closing around him like a trap, because the document did not attack his wife with petty palace gossip or emotional anger, but instead it came directly from his mother, carrying the absolute authority of the monarch who had shaped the modern crown before him. To defend Camilla too strongly in front of the senior officials would look like a direct defiance of the late Queen's final wishes, yet to accept the letter too quickly would leave the woman he loved completely exposed and stripped of her perceived authority in front of the entire family. William stayed completely silent throughout the initial shockwave, but his deliberate silence spoke volumes as the prince watched and unfold the crisp paper slowly, understanding deeply that this was not a theatrical performance, but a sacred duty delayed until the exact moment it could no longer be avoided, and then read one single line from the documented instruction, a signed royal letter designed specifically to give written direction when spoken wishes might later be challenged or conveniently forgotten by those seeking more influence. The line itself was brutal in its stark simplicity, stating clearly that if Camilla attempted to claim authority beyond her traditional ceremonial role, and was explicitly commanded to intervene with the full backing of the previous sovereign, there was no raised voice, no dramatic accusation, and no aggressive gestures, just the undeniable validity of the Queen's signature cutting cleanly through every excuse and every political maneuver Camilla had spent months preparing. The sudden, sharp scrape of Camilla's chair carried through the silent room like a stark warning, and though she did not leave the chamber just yet, her sudden movement told everyone present that she had been deeply and permanently wounded. Charles lowered his eyes in a rare display of public vulnerability, and kept her gaze completely steady and fixed across the table, and William did not make any move to rescue the suffocating silence that filled the spaces between them. In that pivotal moment, the council understood that this was not merely a petty dispute over one meeting, one leather folder, or one specific ceremonial title, but rather it was a historic battle over institutional trust, and the late Queen had already chosen who would defend the line. But before the room could fully comprehend the true weight of Anne's calculated move, every single eye turned toward the individuals whose lives and futures were now tightly trapped inside that single, signed page of royal history. No one in that room was simply a detached witness anymore, as princess and still like a woman carrying a sacred promise. Camilla sat like a woman publicly stripped of her certainty. Charles looked like a king cornered by his own memory, and William understood that this reopened wounds the palace had tried to bury for decades, and had entered the council with the distinct calm of someone who had already made peace with the personal cost of her actions, proving she was not there to win approval, but to keep faith with the mother who had trusted her when softness was no longer an option. To everyone watching, her stillness felt almost severe, but beneath that cold exterior was a deep loyalty sharpened by grief, a lifelong reputation as a royal who would never bend duty to comfort. Camilla had truly believed her place beside Charles would protect her from such a public correction, having spent years becoming more visible, more accepted in ceremony, and more familiar in the rhythm of royal life. But the letter drew a sharp, immovable line between public support and private authority, making it clear that while public support meant standing beside the monarch at events, private authority over confidential decisions was something she could never claim. Charles felt that difference like a physical wound, looking not just like a husband watching his wife suffer, but like a son hearing his mother speak from beyond the grave with firmness he could never argue away. He knew Camilla was furious, but he also knew and was not inventing power for herself. She had brought undeniable proof, leaving him trapped between the woman beside him and the final judgment of the monarch who came before him. William watched his hand rest firmly on the letter, realizing this document had been held back and guarded for the exact moment when palace boundaries became too blurred to ignore. When a senior aide quietly closed a council folder, that small sound carried more force than any speech, signaling that history was tightening around them, and the deeper question was no longer whether and had embarrassed Camilla, but why the late queen had felt such a severe warning had to be written down in the first place. The heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the grand council chamber after the removal of the folder was not a temporary pause in conversation, but rather the cold and permanent hardening of institutional reality around them, a boundary line drawn in ink that could never be erased or negotiated away by personal affection. To truly comprehend the devastating weight of the signed letter that princess had just placed on the table, the senior officials of the palace and the members of the royal family had to look backward, returning in their memories to one specific, unforgettable private incident months before the late queen's final decline, when a quiet household ceremony at Windsor Castle turned suddenly and deeply cold. It was during the Windsor household honor ceremony, an occasion designed to be entirely simple, deeply respectful and meticulously controlled under the watchful eyes of the long-reigning monarch, that the first subtle signs of quiet coup began to manifest behind the velvet curtains of the palace. In the intricate world of the British monarchy, the established order of precedence, which is a carefully arranged historical ranking that strictly decides exactly who stands, sits, walks, and speaks before whom in every public and private gathering, carries a profound institutional meaning that outsiders can never fully grasp. Within the high walls of a royal palace, a chair is never just a simple piece of furniture. A name placed higher on a formal document is never an administrative mistake, and a royal signature withheld or granted can stop an individual's lifelong ambition before it ever has a chance to become a recognized palace tradition. Camilla had not stormed into that delicate Windsor ceremony with loud demands or overt arrogance, but instead she had moved with a quiet, calculated confidence of someone who firmly believed the immediate future of the monarchy was already adjusting its borders around her growing influence. The revised operational folder for that day's honor ceremony, which had been subtly altered before reaching the Queen's desk, placed certain ceremonial preferences and household decision-making pathways much closer to Camilla's own personal circle of loyal staff, doing so before the reigning sovereign had ever given her personal or formal approval for such a massive structural shift. To a casual observer or a low-level palace employee, it might have looked like a minor administrative correction, a mere update to routine paperwork. But to Queen Elizabeth II, who had spent 7 decades guarding the sacred boundaries of crown, it felt like a calculated test of her fading strength. When the senior household aide placed a ceremonial folder before the aging monarch and paused for a fraction of a second too long, the brilliant mind of Queen understood immediately that something significant had been altered behind her back, as that tiny, hesitant pause betrayed the hidden truth before any spoken words had formed in the room. and who was standing quietly beside her mother's chair during that private session, watched as the monarch's frail hand remained entirely still over the unsigned page, refusing to press her pen against the paper, and that quiet, dignified act of refusal told the princess everything she needed to know about the brewing battle for control. Elizabeth did not look angry at first, her face showing no signs of explosive fury or royal outrage, but instead she looked deeply saddened. And that profound maternal and institutional sadness cut far deeper into Anne's heart than any display of loud rage ever could. The Queen had sacrificed her entire personal life, her comforts, and her private emotions to protect the absolute clarity of the crown from confusion, internal pressure, and private ambitions. Yet now, in the twilight of her historic reign, she was being forced to defend the very borders of her sovereign authority inside her own private household from those she had allowed into her family, and watched the legendary monarch absorb that quiet insult with immense dignity, and the devoted daughter understood the deep personal pain it caused, while the seasoned royal in her recognized the immediate constitutional danger of letting such boundaries blur even by a fraction of an inch. Elizabeth, demonstrating the tactical patience that defined her decades on the throne, waited until the formal ceremony had completely ended and the polite, smiling voices of the guests had faded into the distant corridors before making her definitive countermove. She allowed the grand room to empty entirely, ensuring that no gossip would leak to the lower staff or the media, and then she quietly asked Anne to remain behind, sealing the heavy oak doors against the rest of the palace. No grand announcement followed that fateful command. No warnings were echoed to the intercoms of Buckingham Palace. Just a closed door, a sealed leather folder, and a mother who knew with absolute certainty that her daughter possessed a rare, unbending courage required to do what duty demanded when gentleness had failed to maintain order. In that deeply private conversation, which was later meticulously preserved word for word through Anne's own documented account, delivered strictly to the council's secretary, the dying queen dictated the severe, unyielding warning that would one day shake Camilla's confidence to its very core at the council table. And listened with absolute focus as Elizabeth made the institutional line unmistakably clear, stating that royal authority must never be blurred, softened, or compromised by marriage, temporary emotion, or personal ambition, emphasizing that the crown belongs strictly to the bloodline and the sovereign instruction alone. The document she created that afternoon was not born from a spirit of personal cruelty or lingering resentment toward Camilla, but rather it was born from profound, protective fear that the ancient palace order could be slowly softened by affection until it disappeared into chaos. What began as a quiet, private correction behind the closed doors of Windsor Castle became the ultimate hidden weapon that princess, and carried silently in her hands into the council room months later, waiting patiently until Camilla crossed the final line of authority before revealing its devastating existence to the world. By the time Anne finally chose to unfold the hidden instruction before the gathered officials, the long-brewing confrontation waiting inside the chamber could no longer be softened by polite courtesy or dismissed as a minor family misunderstanding. Camilla, attempting to recover her slipping dignity and reassert her dominance over proceedings, looked directly at the princess and asked one measured, sharp question regarding the legal validity of the paper, but Anne did not flinch or waver for a single moment. The long council table instantly became a silent battlefield without a single voice being raised in anger as Charles shifted uncomfortably in his heavy chair. William lowered his gaze to the floor to absorb the shock and looked directly into the eyes of the queen consort to deliver the definitive line that made the entire room understand why Elizabeth had trusted her daughter with the final, absolute word. Camilla knew she had to speak immediately before the heavy silence of the room solidified into a permanent verdict against her, questioning whether Anne truly possessed the constitutional authority to place a private family instruction into the official council record. The council record was a formal, permanent written account of everything accepted during that ministerial meeting, and entering the late Queen's letter into that specific archive meant that the warning could never again be dismissed as a mere passing family memory, but would instead become a permanent part of the functioning palace machinery. That was precisely why the queen consort challenged the move with such desperation, because she realized she was no longer just fighting against a temporary moment of embarrassment in front of her husband, but she was fighting against a permanent institutional barrier that would limit her power for the rest of her life. And answered the challenge without a single hint of sharpness or malice in her tone, and that lack of emotion made her cold replies significantly more devastating to everyone listening. She pointed calmly to the authentic signature first, then to the precise date of the Windsor incident, and finally to the handwritten personal note inscribed at the very bottom of the ancient parchment page. The handwritten note explicitly authorized the full disclosure of the document if the established palace order or the purity of sovereign succession was ever threatened by internal pressure, and it made it undeniably clear to council that this was exactly the dangerous condition Elizabeth had feared would happen during Charles's reign. Camilla stared at the paper as if it were changing shape directly in front of her eyes, completely paralyzed by the realization that what she had desperately wanted to frame as a petty personal rivalry between sisters-in-law, and had successfully framed as a sacred, unyielding duty to the survival of the British crown. Charles, feeling the immense agony of the situation, whispered Camilla's name just once under his breath, almost as if he were trying to pull her back from the dangerous edge of a confrontation she could never win. But then he suddenly stopped himself as the sheer weight of his sovereign responsibility crashed down upon him, and turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes reflecting a profound, quiet disappointment that struck the king harder than any public rebuke or media scandal ever could. Because without uttering a single word, that look conveyed a devastating truth. This was not the moment for a monarch to protect personal comfort, and this was not the moment to weaken the crown for the sake of marital peace. He found himself completely trapped in an impossible, agonizing space between the furious woman sitting directly beside him and the memories of the mother whose definitive handwriting lay flat on the table before him. And in that suffocating silence, his inability to speak became the definitive answer that everyone in the room noticed. William did not interrupt the agonizing dynamic, choosing instead to watch and place her hand flat on the paper, removing any lingering hope that this document could ever be hidden away from the official history of the realm again. The institutional reality initiated by the late Queen's letter transformed what was once a hidden, private royal friction into a fully binding, enforceable authority that effectively rewrote the internal operations of contemporary British monarchy before the council members could even leave their seats. A royal signature can indeed be a very quiet thing when historical documents are drafted behind closed doors, but as the senior legal advisors and the council secretary examined the parchment, that quiet ink developed the absolute power to permanently close doors that ambition had spent years trying to unlock. Camilla sat completely motionless in her designated seat, staring blankly at the polished surface of the table, while and remained standing like an immovable pillar of historical continuity, forcing King Charles to accept that this specific document was not a sentimental family relic or a vague expression of maternal anxiety, but a definitive sovereign command waiting to be fully obeyed, and deeply understood that the dynamic in the room had moved far beyond initial personal embarrassment. For while the first emotional shockwave had already landed heavily upon Camilla's pride, the second institutional blow was significantly colder and more permanent because the council was now forced to determine exactly what the Queen's words allowed. The operational boundaries outlined in the letter were deeply tied to the Crown's inner structure, family trust, and formal constitutional procedures, specifically the hidden channels of power that dictate exactly who is permitted to view sensitive state papers, who can influence internal household choices, and who is allowed to speak in the heavily guarded rooms where the monarchy protects itself from external pressure. Camilla had been publicly respected and highly visible beside Charles at state openings, community tours, and international visits. But Elizabeth had drawn an incredibly sharp, unyielding line between that public, ceremonial dignity and actual, internal governing influence. The council secretary, acting in his official capacity as the preservation officer of the archive, read the core clause of the document aloud to the assembly, and every single word that left his mouth seemed to tighten the air in the chamber until breathing felt like a deliberate effort. His formal, monotonic voice effectively transformed the private letter into a living institutional directive that the machinery of the state could not ignore, confirming that and held the absolute authority to challenge, stop, and reverse any attempt to expand Camilla's role into governing areas strictly reserved for the royal bloodline and sovereign instruction. This did not remove the queen consort from the public fabric of royal life, but did something far more painful to her personal standing. It explicitly defined her limits in front of the very senior officials whose loyalty she had spent months cultivating. Charles felt the full constitutional burden settle across his shoulders like a lead weight, caught in the agonizing duality of being a reigning king who must command authority, and a grieving son hearing his mother's firm, unarguable judgment delivered from beyond the grave. Elizabeth was no longer physically present in the grand chamber to explain the deep maternal tenderness or the protective worries behind the warning, leaving the king with nothing but the raw, unbending force of the written instruction itself. He could feel the cold, furious silence radiating from Camilla beside him. He could see the absolute, disciplined restraint maintained by and across from him, and somewhere in that impossible space between the two women, he understood that palace power had become personal in the cruelest way possible, and did not display a single hint of victory or celebration, her face looking deeply tired, almost entirely hollow, as if the immense historical burden of delivering this letter to her brother had cost her far more personal peace than Camilla could ever bring herself to believe. The sealed annex attached to the core document, which was formally opened only after the council secretary had verified the validity of the primary signature, contained precise administrative restrictions regarding state briefings, certain confidential household papers, and internal policy decisions that required direct royal lineage. As each individual restriction was read aloud, the public humiliation deepened for Camilla because the boundaries were no longer presented as emotional family tensions, but as a rigid, legally structured palace reality that could not be modified by the king's personal affection. A senior household aide then stepped forward toward Camilla's place at the table and quietly removed a prepared leather folder containing the restricted materials, an act so symbolic and definitive that no one in the room required a single word of explanation to understand its meaning. Charles saw it. William watched it with intense focus, and then lowered her eyes to allow her sister-in-law a final shred of privacy. But the stark absence of that folder on the table said what no courtier dared to speak aloud. The letter was already actively changing the power structure of the palace. With that folder removed, the emotional and political fallout began to settle over the family like dust. For Camilla did not shout. She did not plead for her husband's intervention, and she did not break down into tears before the council. But instead, she simply stared at the empty space before her and understood that her access had been permanently revoked. By the following morning, the palace could no longer contain the internal explosion within its high stone walls, as the story quickly leaked into the national consciousness, captured perfectly by a dramatic newspaper front page showing Camilla leaving the council entrance entirely alone, her face composed but visibly strained beneath a massive headline reading, "The Queen's Letter Speaks." Suddenly, what was meant to be a private household correction became a massive public debate on loyalty, authority, and memory, forcing broadcasters to describe the moment as a historic clash between public royal rank and private sovereign trust, and was no longer being discussed by the public as merely the king's hard-working sister, but she was now framed as the ultimate guardian of Elizabeth's final boundaries, the one individual prepared to defend the late monarch's legacy, even when the personal cost was devastatingly high. Camilla sat in her private quarters watching the relentless media coverage, realizing that the absence of the folder had become the absolute proof of her exclusion, showing the world that while she stood near the throne, the letter had stopped her from ever reaching into actual governing power. William felt the immense pressure rising around his own position, understanding that the public now viewed him as the future beneficiary of Elizabeth's demand for structural clarity, placing a heavy, silent responsibility on his young shoulders to protect the next reign from internal confusion and private influence disguised as duty. In the final, quiet reckoning away from the public eye, and then Charles met alone in a private room at the palace where state protocol could no longer hide their shared familial pain, and the king asked the hardest question of his life, whether their mother had truly lost faith in him before her passing. Charles carried that agonizing question like an open wound, admitting that small warnings had been present for months, quiet moments when affection had made him look away from the blurring of palace boundaries that others could see clearly, and softened then, speaking not as an institutional rival but as a devoted sister, reassuring Charles that Elizabeth had never feared his intentions, but feared the crown becoming emotionally compromised until duty could no longer stand firm on its own. She revealed that during their final conversation, the Queen had specifically spoken William's name, stating that the next generation would need absolute structural clarity more than temporary personal comfort, because confusion today inevitably becomes conflict tomorrow. Hearing that, Charles's anger dissolved into pure grief, realizing that it had not exposed him to weaken his reign, but had obeyed their mother to steady the long-term future of the monarchy. The council formally accepted the late Queen's signed letter as the absolute guiding instruction for all future access disputes, restoring the restricted council papers to Anne's direct supervision and permanently removing Camilla from that channel of governing influence. In the end, the letter did not destroy the fabric of the British monarchy, but rather clarified it with absolute precision, leaving Camilla beside the king but strictly within her ceremonial limits, leaving and as a trusted guardian of the boundary, and showing William with absolute certainty what Elizabeth had been protecting all along.